From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's today's lineup. K-State's Glynn Tonsor awaits to share his take on the current cattle market trends. Glynn will talk about topics he was hearing from producers about at the Cattle Industry Convention that took place last week. Then Britton Rucker will talk with K-State's Justin Waggoner about pre- and post-calving nutrition management for beef cows and heifers. He'll look at matching forage quality to those nutritional needs and supplemental feeding options for late gestation and after calving. And Jeff Wickman has this week's Kansas 4-H segment, where K-State's Pam Van Horn talks about the 4-H Horse Project with the current State 4-H Horse Volunteer of the Year, Melody Bearley from Rawlins County, plus more, here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Listening to the K-State Radio Network. And welcome once again to Agriculture Today. For this week's insight on the cattle markets, we bring by once more from the Agricultural Economics Department here at K-State, livestock economist Glynn Tonsor of K-State Research and Extension. And we have quite a selection of things we want to pick up on this time around, Glynn. But as always, give us a quick look back at the trade last week, which for the most part was at worst even keel, and maybe a bit of encouragement in those prices, too.
Yeah, I mean, I would call this past week pretty much bland and non-eventful, mainly because of Mother Nature in many ways. But if we look at the futures market first here, the nearby live cattle contract on Friday was closed at $125.5. That was down right at 50 cents for the week. It's up about $2 for the year for context. The cash market for fed cattle, $123 and change was the 5 market price through Friday. Really low volume. Again, that's pretty much flat from the prior week. When we look over to feeder cattle, the cash trade was flat to $4 higher, is how AMS called it, depending on what market you look at. I will note here, before we go any further, Mother Nature was extreme this past week. AMS noted there were several auction markets, particularly north of us here, that either canceled or rescheduled, so volumes were low as well. So I don't want to overreact to the flat or even a couple dollar higher cash prices. Mm-hmm. When you look at the board, March feeder cattle price, $142.5, down about $1 for the week. And again, I'm not going to overreact to that. I will highlight just a little bit is feeder cattle being down a little bit on the board and compared to the live cattle more. I do think reflects some feedlot profitability squeeze that's expected 6-9 months from now. Myself and others have been talking more about that, so we won't belabor that here. But the first quarter appears to be pretty good for feedlot operators from a profitability closeout perspective. But after that, we have some concerns. The last thing from breaking down the market this past week was the Pratt report. So some Kansas numbers here. 585-pound steers. There was a lot of 90 head sold at $175. Heavier weights at $832. There was a lot of 316 head that sold at $142. Those were roughly flat for the prior week. But again, there wasn't many to compare to the prior week. So to summarize, there's not a lot of movement to react to. And it was really cold. No matter where our listeners are sitting, I'm confident you were cold last week.
And retail beef trend last week, the cutout was the same refrain, it sounds.
Yeah, so wholesale choice was $214 on Friday. Select was $213 on Friday. Flat in the case of choice for the year so far, and that's not necessarily surprising, but I'll note it. It's very different than select, which is up about $5. I'm honing in on that because we basically have a zero. I mean, it's $1 at the moment, choice select spread. We need to monitor that over the next 4 or 5 months. It's very common that peaks going in towards the 4th of July. We need to watch that as another demand signal, and that'll segue here in a minute into our broader topics for 2019. And what I was hearing in the hallways in New Orleans is lots of recognition how important demand was in 2018, but some growing concerns about what it'll be here in 2019.
We'll tap you for your observations on your trip to the Cattle Industry Convention in just a moment. USDA will be forthcoming with numbers finally. The partial government shutdown is over, and so the schedule of those reports that were put on hold has now been released, Glynn.
Yeah, so there's several reports impacted by that, but the two that are probably most immediately relevant for our audience here one is the cattle on feed report. There was one that was scheduled for January 25th. It's now going to be released on February 22nd. And I'll follow that up as the next cattle on feed report, which would have been the February one, is scheduled to come out on March 8th. What USDA is doing there is they're purposely staggering those monthly reports. They come out about every 2 weeks until we're quote-unquote back on schedule. And then perhaps of most importance, that's debatable depending on the segment you talk about, but the January cattle inventory report was one I was particularly concerned about if it wasn't going to occur or not. And it was announced that's going to be released on February 28th. So while that is 1 month later than we normally receive it, it is good news that it has been announced they're going to do it and release it. I'll remind our listeners that's where we get state-specific information on herd size and expansion plans and so forth. And that's pretty important from a longer-term, how big our herd is perspective. And I'm pleased to hear we're going to get that report.
And there's been speculation as to what that report will say, even as the original date came and went. And that speculation hasn't changed much, has it?
It has not. And yours truly thinks herd expansion is pretty much towards the end. And I think that report will signal that. Very small incremental increase from a year ago is what I'm anticipating. But again, there's lots of uncertainty around that. And I'm happy to see the report scheduled to come out at the end of February.
Well, you did spend some time visiting with producers and sharing some information as well at the Cattle Industry Convention last week in New Orleans, and you picked up some hallway chat, as you put it, Glynn. What are the primary subjects of interest that you ran across down there as you interacted with producers?
Yeah, so for at least the attendees that made their way to New Orleans, and I will interject, I suspect there was more that were going to that ended up having to stay home to take care of cold things, so I don't know what the final attendance was, but the sense I got was there is a growing recognition that both domestic and foreign demand for beef was really important in 2018. And I'm not just saying that because I've been saying it, is literally that came up more and more in the hallway. And I'm reinforcing that because that's important. And as an economist, that's going to remain vital here in 2019 because we have what was described by a cattle facts economist, Lance Zimmerman, down there as a logjam of meat. So we have a lot of meat in the system. So demand strength is going to be even more important here in 2019. And I'm highlighting this because I'm glad to see most in the hallway recognize that. Doesn't mean that those in the hallway can guarantee it's going to continue to be strong, but recognizing is step number one. I'm also bringing it up because there's more optimism that we'll continue to export beef successfully here in 2019, just like we did in 2018. And it's nice to be surrounded by that optimism. At the risk of coming across as Dr. Bear, I'm probably a little more concerned about that than some others were in the hallway. This is case in point where Glynn hopes he is wrong. I hope my pessimism proves to be incorrect. For the sake of transparency, for over a year, I've been pleasantly surprised that we've exported more than I thought we would. I hope that continues. I just see plenty of warning signs out there, and I'm glad to see that the producers in general are recognizing the importance of both domestic and foreign demand, and I hope that that ongoing education effort continues to be successful.
But your warning signs have to do with ongoing uncertainty as far as trade tariffs and
it's trade tariffs, the negotiations about market access in general. Tariffs are the cost once you're in, and then on top of that is the more general macroeconomic situation. Mm-hmm. So as economies grow, they spend more. Beef is a high value, expensive item, so we tend to demand more of it when our incomes are going up. So I have this general econ background on, if the economy slows, that depresses beef demand concern that applies both domestically and abroad. And then specific to abroad is, as you say, the trade deals and the specifics of that. So that latter point is where I'll gladly admit I've been wrong and too bearish for 12 to 18 months because despite that chatter being a little bit bearish in the news at least, we've continued to export a lot more than anticipated. I hope that continues, but it's partly my job to at least highlight the warning signs there.
Well, we ask you each time you come over to pass along your observations on what the beefbasis.com website is telling us as far as calf price projections into the fall, information for planning purposes for our producers. What are the numbers to date?
Yeah, so first I'll talk about the calf crop, then I'll circle back to this spring. So for those that are getting ready to wean calves, hopefully successfully after all this nasty cold we keep talking about in March or April, sell them, for example, in the middle of October. The Beef Basis tool for Salina is projecting a calf price of $169 there in the middle of October. I'm highlighting that specifically because you could take price risk management action if that was attractive to you today. That would be a better price than some anticipated at this point in the cattle cycle. That does reflect about a positive $20 basis projection on top of the October futures contract for those that are following me. A little bit sooner to occur is here in April, really generally March and April, we're going to have a bunch of yearlings sold for those that kept them. And I'll highlight that exact same tool, beefbasis.com. You can project a yearling price for April, and I did that before I came over this morning. April 3rd, Salina, Kansas price of an 850-pounder is being projected at $139. So if you're somebody that either retained your own or bought somebody else's calf this past fall and you're targeting an April sale, you can use this tool. You can also use it if you're expecting to sell calves this coming fall. Regardless, if you're doing some buying or selling of feeder cattle, that's why I continue to highlight this resource. I find it very helpful.
Beefbasis.com, and the overtone of that is that these are pretty good prices to hang your hat on.
Yes, everybody remembers we've had more profitable years than we had in 18 and expected in 19, but I keep reiterating, given the supply, not just of the number of hooves, but competing meats and so forth, if you did not have strong demand, you would have much lower calf prices and yearling prices and fed prices. And I'm highlighting these because if you're abnormally concerned about that, one could continue to consider taking protection given those price opportunities.
Once more, check out that website, handy tool for keeping track of the price prospects for your calves to be marketed, either yearlings this spring or looking further ahead to the fall calf crop. And lastly, we would give a quick preview of an event that you're involved with, Glynn. It's taking place, as it always does, the first Friday in March, in this case, March the 1st. It'll be the annual Cattlemen's Day at Kansas State University, and you will be on that program.
I will be. It's always the first Friday in March. The agenda is out. One of the things I didn't mention in my hallway discussion but was talked about is, what is the situation and the impact of plant-based and more generally alternative meat products. And that's a main theme that's going to be on our program this year. And I'm going to share some of my own takes and what I think is going on from an economist perspective on the plant-based and alternative meat perspective. I'm not ready to call it just an essential threat because, again, there's more questions than answers. But we need to talk about it and get our arms around what we know, what we don't know, why that's important, what we need to be watching for going forward and so forth. And I encourage those that are interested in the topic or just have some general questions and wanting to learn more to come to our session.
That is March the 1st. That is a Friday at the Kansas State University campus, Weber Hall and Arena, the 2019 Cattlemen's Day at Kansas State University. And Glynn, as always, thanks for the update, and we'll catch up with you again soon.
Thanks for having me on, Eric.
Glynn Tonsor, livestock economist, K-State Research and Extension, and with this week's cattle market insight for us on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. I'm Britton Rucker. Today we're going to talk about coming out of the harsh cold weather and what effects you will have potentially on your cow-calf operation. I'm here with Justin Waggoner, beef cattle specialist for K-State Research and Extension. So let's talk a little about, with the cold weather, supplement strategies.
So with cold stress, what we see in terms of its impact on cows would be that our energy requirements are going to increase in those cows. And so anytime we go through a bout of cold stress, what we're really kind of focused on is what we call the lower critical temperature. So that would be the temperature at which the animal, the cow in this case, begins to experience cold stress. Now, obviously, there's several factors that can impact that temperature. One of them, kind of being the hair coat that the cow has. It's also impacted by cow condition. Cows that are in a better body condition, i.e. 5 or 6, where we'd like to have them on a scale of 1 to 9, those cows are going to be more able to handle cold stress than a cow that's, say, going to be in a body condition score of 4. So if we have animals that are in good condition, they've had adequate time to grow a hair coat, and they have a dry winter hair coat, really those animals can withstand some temperatures as low as about 18 degrees Fahrenheit before they begin to experience cold stress. So that's kind of the temperature cutoff that we look at. Now, obviously, if we add precipitation or moisture to that, those cattle can begin experiencing cold stress at temperatures actually as warm as 59 degrees. So if we have an animal that has has not had time to develop an adequate winter coat, and they become wet, we can actually begin experiencing cold stress in those 50 to 60 degree temperatures. So think about that first, bite of winter that comes in early on in the fall or November time frame, usually here in Kansas. And, sometimes we can have some pretty severe cold stress on animals at that time. Now, in the situation we're in now, those cows have had time to adapt. They're kind of coming into, for a lot of producers, we're getting fairly close to calving. So what we have here is we're in the third trimester, our nutrient requirements are coming up, and then we throw the impact of cold stress on top of that in terms of their nutrient requirements.
So you talked a little bit about moisture this season. With moisture comes a series of problems like mud control. How do you effectively go about that on your cow-calf operation coming out of these freezing temperatures that we've recently had?
Sure. So mud can also be a huge problem. It impacts in terms of, the animal's ability to get back and forth from the water trough as well as to the feed bunk, especially if we're I tend to think about it in terms of a feedlot setting. But, anytime we have mud, typically that's associated with reduced performance on the animals. On the cow-calf side, if we're dealing with mud, it's one of those situations where if we have the opportunity, if we're in what I would call, maybe more of a dry lot situation, or, if there's an opportunity where we can actually, begin to move some of that mud, create some piles where those cattle can actually get up and create some dry areas in the pen, that's certainly beneficial. The other thing we can do is we can look at bedding with things like straw or maybe even corn stalks in some instances to give those animals essentially a dry place to lie down, so we don't have that, that surface contact with, the mud in the ground, and those animals are just going to be much more comfortable if they have a place to get up off of those wet conditions in the mud.
So you talked a little bit about feeding in cold weather and coming into calving season. Do you have any nutritional tips to get these cows ready to calf, nutritionally wise and body condition wise?
Sure. So, the first thing would be actually, probably starts at weaning time, and that's taking and assessing body condition score on those cows and making sure that, those cows are in good shape coming into the winter. And the reason I say weaning is that's a really good time for us to say if we've got a thin cow, we can actually do some supplemental feeding. Her nutrient requirements haven't come up at that point. So, there we'd be talking again in the fall on these spring calving cows of maybe taking that body condition score, trying to put some adequate condition on. So that's one thing we can do. Maybe not a mitigation strategy right now, but maybe something to think about in the future. As we look at the situation where, we're well into the third trimester in a lot of operations, and then we combine that with cold stress. So with cold stress, we're really dealing with an increase in the animal's energy requirements. It doesn't increase the protein requirements of the animal. So a good rule of thumb to use is that with cold stress, our maintenance energy requirement increases about 1% for each degree that we're below the lower critical temperature. So what does that really translate into? So if that animal has that dry winter coat, her lower critical temperature is about 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and let's say our daytime, temperature is going to be in that 8 to 10 degree Fahrenheit range, combining that with the wind chill, so the real field temperature for the high of the day is going to be 8 to 10 degrees. In that case, we've got about a 10% increase in that animal's energy requirement. So that gives us some idea of maybe we're going to need to increase the amount of energy that we're providing to those cows. The other thing that often happens when we see cold temperatures, especially with a storm moving through, is if we have cows on extensive environments like pasture or maybe even stock still, typically grazing behaviors reduce. So we kind of have this scenario where the cow's requirement for energy is increasing, both due to the cold stress as well as to where she's at in the third trimester. And then we combine that with maybe reduced grazing behavior. So we've kind of got three things that are converging. And so one of the strategies that I often recommend, especially if we've got a storm that's going to be moving through, we know those temperatures and daytime highs are going to be pretty low, is to supplement those cows with somewhere around 50% of their expected daily intake coming from, let's say, a forage source that's going to be a little bit better than the forage that they're currently grazing. So if those cows would be on corn stalks, if we can supplement them, feed them some hay that's going to be, let's say, a pretty high-quality grass hay, decent protein content, 7-8%, just a little bit better than what the stocks they would be consuming. We still deliver their typical protein supplement, and in some cases we may want to use an additional energy supplement as well if we have something available to us that would be preferably high fiber, that's going to have some energy. Byproduct feedstuffs work well in that scenario. So, adding maybe an extra pound or two of that in front of those cows can sometimes in addition to that, can be a great way for us to meet those additional energetic demands that are placed on those cows simply due to cold stress.
Going into when they calve and the calves are here, do you have any advice on nutrition for them per se? And I know that getting the correct nutrition to the cows is key there, but do you have any tips on keeping them warm or any nutritional advice for the calves?
Well, I think it's just really what we have to be aware of, especially this time of year, is that once that cow calves and we kind of move from a cow that's in the third trimester to one that's lactating, our nutrient requirements go up about, I'm just going to say 25 to 30% to put a range on it. And so that's a dramatic increase in terms of both energy. Protein is also going up as well. So then it begins to kind of think about, if we're grazing stocks, can we rotate to a fresh location? A lot of times doing that, if those cows have been on the same field or circle of stocks all winter, they've grazed it down. And, maybe think about how that fits in the context of the system of, okay, I know these requirements are going up. Is there a way that I can maybe move these cows onto maybe a higher quality forage base? Or do I change, my hay feeding strategy to where I'm feeding a little higher quality hay? Maybe that's some additional supplement in terms of moving from, if we've been feeding 2 pounds, maybe we move to feeding 4 or 5 pounds to try to offset that. So I think the best strategy is, simply to be aware that those nutrient requirements are going up in those cows and trying to put the best quality resources that we've really got available to us in front of them.
Justin, do you have anything else to add to this conversation about correctly getting your cows ready for calving season?
Yeah, I think the last thing that I always try to remind producers about actually, kind of comes back to heifer development. We've got a lot of people that are, a lot of operations that are working, maybe developing heifers over the winter that might be in what we would call sort of a low-input development program. And so I think anytime we've had a winter where we've been exceptionally cold and wet, and we've talked about how that increases energy requirements, that also impacts those heifers in terms of how much they would typically gain during that time frame. So, if you've had heifers in a low-input development type program, I think it's a good idea as you begin to start to think about your breeding program to maybe grab some check weights on those heifers, look at body condition score on those heifers, and make sure that we've got them ready to come into that breeding season, that we've gotten to our target weights that we wanted to be at. We may even see some heifers that have, cattle tend to grow apart, so we may see a set of heifers where, now we kind of have a set of small heifers and some bigger heifers within a group that we're getting ready to breed. And so it's a really good time because that can impact our breeding season as we get closer to maybe looking and preparing those heifers to go into an AI program here in a couple of months.
Thank you, Justin, for all your information on getting your cows ready for calving season nutritionally and how to hopefully improve your operation that way.
All right. Thank you.
That was Justin Waggoner, beef cattle specialist for K-State Research and Extension. I'm Britton Rucker for Agriculture Today. Eric will return with today's agricultural news headlines and more here on the K-State Radio Network.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today from Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson here. And next up, today's agricultural news headlines coming your way. These courtesy in part of DTN. Well, the U.S. and China have moved closer to settling their trade dispute, with President Trump saying he expects to meet again with Chinese President Xi Jinping to resolve the conflict. The president's upbeat assessment came as he met last week with Chinese Vice Premier Liu He in the Oval Office following 2 days of high-level talks between the two sides. And during the talks, the Chinese delegation proposed to the U.S. that the president meet with Xi in China after his planned summit with the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un later this month. At the meeting, the president said China would buy 5 million tons of U.S. soybeans daily. Now, the administration later clarified that China has agreed to buy an additional 5 million metric tons of soybeans, but not daily, and no time frame was specified there. The president told reporters he might be willing to accept a limited agreement by the March the 1st deadline and extend the talks to get a more comprehensive deal. But as Trump and Liu met with reporters, the president said he did not anticipate the need to extend the deadline. His top China trade negotiator, U.S. Representative Robert Lighthizer, said later that the March the 1st deadline remains intact. Now, Liu said that both sides focused the 2-day talks on 3 key themes, which he said were trade, structural issues, and enforcement. Lighthizer described 2 very intense and very long days of discussions. He said the 2 countries are in constant negotiations that would take a short break for the Chinese New Year this week. The president said Lighthizer and Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin would travel to China later this month as negotiations continue. USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue focused on trade as he spoke Friday during the closing session of the 2019 Cattle Industry Convention in New Orleans. On China, the secretary stressed the toughest issues continued to be the administration's positions on protecting U.S. intellectual property. During a press conference prior to his speech, Perdue told reporters he felt there was still a long ways to go on substantive agreements with China. We're heartened by the spirit of Chinese-U.S. talks earlier in the week, in the secretary's words, but he added that trade rules are never done until they're really done, and then it's not really done until there are enforcement mechanisms to permanently protect U.S. interests from forced transfer of intellectual property and intellectual theft. He suggested the president would not sign an agreement that did not contain long-term enforcement language. Perdue also told the cattle producers there that he believes U.S. agriculture has for too long relied on one or just a few customers. Here's more on that from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
We've got a great product, we've got plenty of it, and we need to spread it out.
And no, Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue is not talking about fertilizer there. He's talking about U.S. food and farm products in general. He repeated once again for reporters in New Orleans Friday that he thinks we've relied too much on the large customer countries, China in particular, so that when those big buyers curtail their purchases for whatever reason, there's a huge effect on sales and prices to our producers. So USDA's just awarded $200 million to 57 groups through the Ag Trade Promotion Program
to help find other markets for our products around the world. Anywhere from Africa to Asia to South America, we're looking for new customers.
This money comes out of the program that helps offset losses to farmers because of trade disruptions. Perdue said this $200 million is going to be leveraged with money from the private sector to boost export sales of U.S. food and farm products. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
And Perdue went on to update on efforts that are underway to expand trade with countries like Thailand, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. He added that the administration has not forgotten about Japan and the importance of meat exports to Japanese markets. You are listening to Agriculture Today, and next up, this week's edition of Tree Tales. Here's K-State forester Bob Atchison. Bob?
In the height of the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, the federal government invested $13.8 million to establish over 200 million trees and shrubs in windbreaks and shelter belts throughout the Great Plains. Today, this green infrastructure exceeds 80 years of age and is in need of renovation. While decades of research confirm that windbreaks and shelter belts provide both economic and environmental benefits, they continue to be removed and, most often, not replaced. To protect and sustain this valuable resource, the USDA Forest Service has sponsored a Great Plains Windbreak Initiative in North and South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas. The Great Plains Initiative 2, known as GPI 2, builds on windbreak inventories and condition assessment work accomplished during the initiative's first phase in 2008 and 2009. Windbreaks are not recognized as forest land and therefore have not been included in forest inventories. This has created a gap of knowledge in their condition, the real benefits they provide, and strategies to sustain the resource. For the first time, GPI-2 has created a statewide tree canopy, GIS layer, at 1 meter resolution that identifies windbreak location and will eventually identify their condition. The GIS information, combined with on-the-ground windbreak inventories, will instruct natural resource professionals where to focus limited resources to renovate old windbreaks and establish new ones and address invasive species. GPI-2 also uses NRCS GIS data to identify where wind-blown soil erosion is most at risk to guide the planting of new shelter belts. The project also estimates the ecosystem service values our windbreaks provide for soil conservation, crop yield, energy savings, and livestock operations. Social marketing outreach strategies to engage farmers and ranchers are being developed with guidance from the Yale School of Forestry and the Center for Nonprofit Strategies, tools for engaging landowners effectively. GPI-2 inventory work in Kansas suggests a little over 30,000 miles of windbreaks, with 55% in fair to poor condition and 45% in good condition. 24% of our windbreaks exceed 50 years of age, with 44% between 25 and 50 years. 61% of our windbreaks protect farmsteads, 26% croplands, and 11% livestock. Eastern red cedar dominates windbreaks at 61%, followed by Osage orange at 12%, Austrian pine at 6%, and ponderosa pine at 5%. This is Bob Atchison with the Kansas Forest Service encouraging you not to forget the important benefits our windbreaks and shelter belts offer to the people of Kansas. You have been listening to another Tree Tale.
Many thanks, Bob. Jeff Wickman awaits with this week's Kansas Forage segment for you. That's next here on Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today, 800-321-3276, or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions.
This is Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wickman. The Kansas 4-H Horse Project offers 4-H members an opportunity to learn, handle, care for, and ride horses. They can also participate in judging contests, quiz bowls, and give presentations. Volunteers play a vital role in the success of this project. And K-State 4-H specialist Pam Van Horn says they recently announced the State 4-H Horse Volunteer of the Year. Pam, first off, maybe just some background on the Horse Volunteer of the Year. How did this whole program get started?
Our State 4-H Horse Volunteer program started as a contribution and memorial for Rodney Barrows of Ness City. His two sons, Bronk and Todd, had received some memorial money when he passed away. And Rodney had been very active with 4-H and the horse program, served on the state horse council, and had a heart for 4-H. And they just wanted to contribute back to the 4-Hers in the memory of their father.
And this has been going on for a number of years?
This is the 5th year that we've been doing the State 4-H Horse Volunteer of the Year, and it's amazing the quality of people that we have that have won this award.
And you just recently named another winner.
That is correct. We just completed with our 2019 4-H Horse Panorama, and that's where we announce our Volunteer of the Year. just to learn about what they do is just wonderful.
And this year's winner is from Rawlins County.
That is correct. And the application is just a little bit unique compared to a lot of other things. Sometimes the volunteers don't know they've even been nominated, and the local county or local district or just the local people will put together a resume on behalf of that person, and then the extension agent, a 4-H member, and another volunteer in the county will submit a letter of reference.
And there's really a lot that goes into this nomination process, a lot of criteria.
Oh, there's criteria because we want to know what they have done to grow the program, how they're interacting with the 4-H members and with the parents, and then how they interact with an extension agent. So it is a dynamic way to hear and receive feedback on jobs well done.
Well, and speaking of a job well done, we've got the winner on the phone with us. Go ahead and introduce us.
Our 2018 State 4-H Horse Volunteer of the Year, because it was done for last year, is Melody Bearley.
Melody, go ahead and tell us about, I guess, first of all, your reaction to being named the Horse Volunteer of the Year.
Well, I was very surprised. I had a 4-H parent in November send me a text message asking me if I had 4-H as a kid, and I said yes, but unfortunately that day I was really busy, so I didn't follow up. And when I did follow up with her, she was very hush-hush about what was going on. So even though I knew something was up, I had no idea that it was to this magnitude.
How long have you been involved with the Horse Project?
I have been involved with the Horse Project since my son started in the Horse Project, so that's been 5 or 6 years that I've been involved, and I've actually been leading the program for the last probably 4 years.
Talk a little bit more about that. What goes into heading up this project?
For us, it's a lot of education. We have, prior to my son starting Horse 4-H, we just didn't have a whole lot of the program, and not very many people knew what to do with horses or how to even get started in Horse 4-H. And so it's been a lot of educating, not only for the kids, but also for the parents. Many of them either had horses, hobby horses, but never showed horses or didn't even have horses as children. So educating has taken a lot of our time, getting people up to speed on what they're looking for in a horse, how to take care of a horse, what projects, what classes, and what events they can even participate in.
And Todd emphasized when he introduced Melody was basically there was no program at all in Rawlins County, and taking it from nothing to having a lot of excitement with the program.
I wouldn't say that we had no program, but we did not have a county horse show. We just had showmanship. Was the only event that we had for a few years prior to my boys starting, and I just knew that that was a real shame and wanted my kids to be able to experience and other kids to be able to experience the joy of actually riding and getting more involved with their horse projects.
I think that the youth can be as young as 7 years old. What's kind of the age range that you've been working with?
Our youngest members are that 7 years, and right now our oldest members are 14 and 15, but they would have started at age 10.
I'm kind of wondering if you can maybe think of any stories that might demonstrate just how much fun it is to work with these youth.
My favorite memory was one of the first years that we had practice, and we had 7 youth, many of them, like I said, that had not had experience riding as a group or even loping their horses. And we start riding in February and attempt to be ready for some horse shows in May and June. And when we first started, the horses were a little bit rowdy and the kids were unexperienced, and I really didn't think that we would get to lope our horses on the rail going the same direction all together until like June, maybe, if we were lucky. And it was April, and I was brave, and the kids were doing really well, and so I asked the kids to lope their horses, and everyone was going the same direction. Everybody was loping. Everybody was not getting bucked off or falling off. And we made a couple passes, and I asked the kids to stop their horses. And then I told the parents that they needed to applaud their children, because most parents don't know how difficult, if you've never tried to do it, how difficult it really is to have that speed and that much commotion and have them all being successful at it. I think that was one of my favorite memories, is when we got to that point, and the kids were proud of themselves and the parents were proud of them and understood what an accomplishment that was. I've worked with a lot of these since they were 7, and just to see each year how they come into the arena with more confidence and more knowledge and are ready to take on newer tasks and more challenging classes. You know, we didn't even do the ranch horse class the first couple of years and reining because we just weren't technically able to accomplish them. And in the last couple of years, we've had more and more kids that have been technically able to take on those classes, and so we've started doing those classes. So it's really exciting to see them come along.
And you also are looking for ways to innovate, so you're always kind of coming up with new ideas?
Yes, being in Northwest Kansas, we don't have necessarily a lot of opportunities for our kids to do stuff with horses other than ranch work, and so we try to include some of that as well as our program, you know, not just focusing on the showmanship and the pleasure and those type classes, but we've also tried to do some rodeo, roping, cattle working, trail rides, just stuff to get the kids exposed to things outside of the arena and different things in the arena than just the regular 4-H horse classes.
And I'm sure that Pam, for one, is very appreciative of what you do, and congratulations on the award.
I think it's wonderful that volunteers take the effort and teach our young people all these skills. If it's not for the volunteers, our 4-H program wouldn't even exist. So I applaud volunteers because I know how hard and what time and dedication it takes to do this.
That's K-State 4-H specialist Pam Van Horn and State 4-H Horse Volunteer of the Year Melody Bearley of Rawlins County. To learn more about the Kansas 4-H Horse Project, contact your local extension office or go online to kansas4h.org. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. Along with Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.